Welcome to my demo for Grisaille underpainting for watercolor. We're going to work on a very bright bluebird as subject, and I'll take you through the process of the gray underpainting based on a black and white photo. I make 2 copies of the black and white photo in grayscale setting. Lots of detail, soft undertones and values. I keep one as a reference, and I have a second one as a tracing copy. I use a red ballpoint pen to apply pressure for the line work. That helps me also see the red line to know where I've traced and gives a nice even pressure. The tracing paper I use is actually graphite tracing paper. It produces a pencil line. It's not carbon paper, which is waxy. It can be erased and removed, and the tracing paper is very, very sensitive on the watercolor paper. Now that we've got the drawing transferred, I get my good print of the grayscale image, and let's start painting. I'm using my ivory black mixture with some clean water. And first I'm going to paint some test washes just to have a reference, putting some puddles in my tray, and I transfer a brush load to each clean puddle. Gives me 3 different degrees of wash: a light wash, a medium, a little darker, a medium wash, and a dark wash with a fair amount of pigment added to the water. These patches, once they're dry, will also give me a test area to try out my glazes over top, the colors that I wanted to use. I also do some fine lines, and I lift off a drop of water while I can still erase it. And you'll notice that I'm constantly cleaning my brush in fresh water. My brush with water, but I've left a bit of wash here so that you can see the pooled wash instead of clear water. It's got a little bit of wash in there, just for demo's sake. Usually I would do this part with clean water, and I get it really wet. You can see by the wet shine there that this paper surface is soaked. That brush was loaded with water. I take it right up to the edges of the drawing, and I leave some areas beyond where I want to have some soft gray washes so that it's got a place to blend. Now this pale wash could even count as a color in your work if you wanted it to. I'm grabbing the areas where, I'm sorry that you can't see the rest of the photo. I'm going to add some darks now and let them softly blend. This is regular watercolor wet in wet technique. So I'm taking full pigment and dropping it into the fully wetted zones on the paper. This leaves really nice soft edges, and you'll notice it even more. Right now you can see the creeping in that gray wash, but later that staining pigment blends really, really softly into the wet water on the paper, and it'll give a really nice soft gradient. You can do some small detailed wet and wet blends, but just remember that that paint is going to have soft edges except where there's dry paper, and it's going to dissolve and you'll lose some of the detail, which we can reinforce later. The benefit of these washes is that they can go layer over layer over layer. Once this wet and wet area is dry, fully dry, then we can take a medium wash and paint lots and lots more detail if you wanted to get right down to the fine feathering or direction of the quills and the things on the feathers. you could just keep going and going and going with detail once this wash is dry. I also use the very, very tip of the brush to daub paint into the wet areas. Rather than leaving a full brush mark, this is a great way to just add a tiny, tiny increments and blurs of soft tonal areas of color. We don't want too many hard edges. Now, you'll notice that the brush that I'm using, even for these small details, is fairly large. And the benefits of a really good quality brush, watercolor brush, is that the tip of the brush remains that fine, fine point. And you can paint a very detailed painting with one brush quite often. The belly of a large brush contains enough to hold lots of water, but the tip is also fine enough to get really good detail. And now this wash, that initial wash, is starting to dry, so you can see these marks are a little bit harder edged. They're not softening and blurring as much. And I start to concentrate more on sharper details now. But I hope you can see the medium tone of wash and the soft lines and blends up in the upper part. It's nice to work right up against the edge with a full loaded brush, and there's still a bit of wetness in that head, so it's blending around the eyes. Feathers and wings are always interesting to me. There's a structure beyond the colors on the bird. There's a physical structure to the way that they've folded their wings. They have a very sharp shoulder, and then the feather, how would you say, layers radiate down from that shoulder, from short feathers at the top of the shoulder to longer and longer wing feathers all the way down. It's so important when you're working on something like this to have a really good photo. The closer you want to get to painting realistic renderings, the better your photo should be. If you're just doing abstracts or very loose impressionistic work, you can get away with a looser or smaller photo. The other thing too is that working on this size, I can get lots and lots of information at this scale. If I were trying to paint a smaller bird, it would be more difficult to have a variation of techniques, have those soft blends and these nice sharp details defined and working visually. Some nice little wash brush strokes, just defining the shoulder and the chin. I use, on fresh paint, my clean paper towel I keep handy in my other hand all the time, just for lifting. If I feel that something's too dark or goes over the line or is needs a little bit of lightening, I've got a paper towel handy. Now you can see the full potential of this tonal black. This is ivory black, and getting some really nice sharp variations in the value coming up on this bird. details, and finally doing a little bit of feathering off the back of the elbows. And this brush that I'm using is the number 10 sable brush, and as I say, it's a fairly large brush, holds a lot of water, but it also gives me lots and lots of detailed point that I can work with. I'm going to switch over to a smaller brush and a closer up view so you can see really well the tiny details and things coming up. If you feel your lines are too dark, you can just lift them slightly with that dry paper towel or with the dry brush, but your brush needs to be dry and clean. Little bits of information, just highlighting and redefining some of those wing marks. Now again, I'm working at this scale. You could paint this bird twice this scale and do every tiny little miniature feathering on these feathers, and it would all show underneath in the end as we lay in colored washes over top. Every little detail that we're building up here with these tonal values will show through the transparent layers of watercolor later. So whatever shows in your black and white photo, you can replicate in your Grisaille method to achieve a shaded version of a color later on. And you'll see that at the very end when we do the washes over top. If you've got a lot of fine, straight work to do, I have a pretty steady hand, so I can run that line really easily, but you can bridge your hand by holding your hand over top of your other wrist so that it's not kind of floating free. It's got some support close to the brush, closer to the brush than your wrist hanging off in midair. Or you can work with a small sheet of paper over top of the details and make sure that your hand is supported on the paper. Now I think of birds' feet and all the ways that they're related to reptiles. So they have these kind of lizard-like layers of scaly toes and things. And the structure of the bird's feet is so important. But the kicker is going to be that dark eyeball. There's a white eye ring on this bluebird, so I've just highlighted it beyond the circle of the eye. Add in some extra darks for that back. And even just a tiny bit of color left on the brush leaves some really nice gray washes. Last tail feathers coming in here. And I haven't used any resist in this illustration, but there is an opportunity if you want to maintain any white details, perhaps the dot in the center of the eye, or some shine on his toes, or the pure white breast area, or even some of the linear information on the shoulders. I've got 100% paint now on here, and just very finely painting around that eye spot, and then I feed the paint out to the edges so that I don't cover up that eye spot again. This white sparkle in the eye is so crucial and brings life to any little critters that you might be painting. So it's really important. You can go in and paint it back in later with gouache or a white tip pen, I suppose, but I like to do it on the paper. A little bit of detail on the beak, and we're done. So we've completed our Grisaille study for the bluebird, and you can see all the details from the gray washes and layers that we've prepared. And now that this is nice and dry, you would put the blue color washes over top, because what we're aiming for is this great colorful bluebird. So one of the things that I need to do now is test the transparency of the blue pigments that I have on hand and how I can make the washes and create the blends to paint the blue over glaze over the gray paint. So we're going to go in. I've got 4 different blues here. Cerulean blue is a greeny turquoise blue. Cobalt blue is a very purpley blue. It's very similar to ultramarine. Ultramarine we know as really, really intense, fabulous color. And the other one I have that's a very greeny blue is manganese blue. And I'm going to try these ones out on a test over my gray underpainting, just to make sure that one or another is more transparent or less transparent. So I'm going to bring you along on that little experiment right now. So I've got a good amount of cerulean pigment. What I'm looking for is whether it covers up the transitions. So that's my cerulean. Rinse my brush. And I'm going to put the manganese next to it because I'd like to compare these 2 blues as well. And it's much easier to do that when I have them right next to each other. So this is the manganese blue. Very, very bright. And I think immediately you can see the luminosity of that paint compared to the cerulean. And I can see my blacks really boldly through that color. Now I know that manganese is actually a much more transparent pigment than the cerulean. Even though they're very similar in color, I'm getting much sharper definition to my black edges and things than I am here. There's a little more chalkiness covering up. The cobalt blue, cobalt blue, again a fabulous pigment, great color. I'm going to lay that in. Nice and strong wash so that I get a really good sense of the coverage potential of that pigment. My brush a good rinse. And now I'll go in for the ultramarine blue. Again, the same nice, rich potency. But I find that the ultramarine blue, like the manganese, has a brighter, more saturated pigment, and it's letting me see the sharp edges. I can still see through the cobalt, but it's a little bit cloudier than the ultramarine pigment. So What you can do as well, these are just laid over pure washes, but I'm going to wet this feather, and all of that gray information stays where I put it because this is one of my staining pigments. It's nice and dry. But I want to try out a blend on this from the manganese. And we can do wet and wets with this next blend. So we wetted that area. So we've got wet and wet blends in the gray, but we can also do the wet and wet blends with the colors. Get beautiful highlights and details. Blending over top. I'm going to put in a really big load of ultramarine up at this end. And I've avoided wetting the little stem in the middle of the feather. I'm going to go in and add a little more manganese down here where it's bright. So there's a good example of a wet and wet wash of colors over the wet and wet and detailed work of the Grisaille. So I've shown you a test, color test, to try out your transparencies over top of your gray mixtures. But when we did the gray demo, we also left some test mixtures up in the corner. So I'm also going to put some washes over top of those and see how they feel with 100% color and some nice transparent layers. Both of these are really nice and luminous. I decided to use the manganese blue and the ultramarine blue. Really, really nice mixtures. Because this bird not only has that radiant blue, it also has a beautiful turquoisey note to the color on the front of the breast and underscoring all of the ultramarine blue color as well. So we're going to work with those two colors in a wet wash over top of this Grisaille mixture that we've created. So my first task is to wet. I'm going to wet the whole thing. I have a little bit of whiteness in the butt of that bird, but everything else has blue on it. Now, because we tested our gray mixtures, I know that this paint's not going to move because I did test it. But I want to have that nice wet blend for the color everywhere else. So that piece is really wet now, so that I know I can go in for these lovely soft washes in here just by adding some of that beautiful manganese blue up into the face, up into the forehead. Going to work with that. We do still have a white eye ring, so I'm going to leave that unpainted. just so that it comes up nice and crisp. So we've got a nice blend there. A little bit of blend around the back of the legs and up into the breast. And then I'm going to start working with the ultramarine blue in around the tail feathers and here to add some striking blue notes. Too much solid paint in there. And lots and lots of ultramarine blue in the back of the head. Now this ultramarine blue is going to go right over the whites in the gray and give me those details. I don't want to blend too much with that breast color because that's kind of a separate area. But I'll bring this in, soften that blend. And I'm going to add another good dose of the manganese blue to really pull up the brightness of the bluebird. A little bit more behind there. And a little bit creeping down under here. I'm going to use a paper towel just to lift that slightly. And you have to be careful not to leave that behind. I like to use a damp paper towel to make sure it's not pressing a pattern on the paper. Paper is very sensitive, and don't wipe it too roughly. You'll disturb the surface of the paper. And we're only lifting the blue here because the gray underpainting is going to stay where we put it. Take a really clean brush and wet an area that you want to lighten or soften the edges. And I always wipe it on my paper towel to make sure that there's no paint that I'm putting back down. So this guy looks almost like he's ready to go. Soften up some edges. And we've got a really nice blue bird.